Hey everybody, welcome to the Let Me Ask You This podcast. I'm your host, Chris Del Pozo, and this is a podcast designed to help debunk misconceptions about mental health therapy, one episode at a time. I have a very special guest today, Sean Krause. He is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and he enlightens us on perspectives of therapy from the therapist's side. So we go over topics about why people go to therapy, why people can benefit or how people can benefit from therapy, and we even dive into topics about misconceptions about anxiety and depression. So if this is something that's going to be interesting to you, then I really hope that you stay tuned for the full episode. It's a lot of great content, and if this is something that you enjoy, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment more information and more content that you would like to see on this podcast. I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for doing this. I'm very excited because you are my first therapist.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Okay,
you're my
fantastic.
first licensed therapist to be able to come and just enlighten perspectives, because that's the ultimate goal, is to just provide perspectives on how these things could be utilized in everybody's benefit, right? So, but let's go ahead and start. So my first question is going to be kind of where your interest into psychology and therapy kind of stemmed from.
Right. Honestly, when I thought about that question, I was kind of like, I don't know. I started off as going for my aerospace engineer degree. And somewhere down the line, I was kind of like, I don't know if this is for me. So I think it was like I was 3/4 done with my bachelor's degree.
Wow.
Like almost done. And I was doing a lot of CAD work, and I was like, I don't want to be on a computer all day. I like talking to people. And then I was also kind of like, I don't enjoy these types of problems. I enjoy talking to people about problems that are more involved in them themselves. So I have a friend who does engineering, and he's like, I don't talk to people for about 2 weeks at a time, kind of thing. And I'm like, wow, I don't want to be like that. So yeah, that kind of started my journey, switching to psychology. And another pivotal point was when I met with, I did I guess a camp counseling kind of thing up in Minnesota. And I had met a bunch of students there. And my job was to just take them on canoe trips, backpacking trips through Canada. And somewhere down the line, I had this revelation of I want to do that within the realm of therapy. So I want to be able to, do camping trips or at least just some type of adventure therapy mixed in with actual therapy.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Give me 1 second. So, but to go back to what you were saying. So, really, what was your passion? Was more of just the aspect of you wanted something to involve talking. Now, did you know somebody that was in psychology or therapy, or was it just
not.
like, how did it become like an option? Did someone present it to you, or you just happened to come across it?
I think I just came across the concept of doing some form of counseling after I was in Minnesota. And then I ended up working at Operation PAR, which is a substance abuse place. And it was like probably I had gotten my psychology degree, and I was like, what can I do with this now? And so then I went into the substance abuse aspect, and this was like my first opportunity, my first taste of what is this like? And after doing that, I was like, wow, I love talking to people. I love helping people. It's such a rewarding field. And so from then I was like, okay, well, what is my next step in this journey? And it was becoming a marriage and family therapist.
Awesome. Love it. So now, how long have you been practicing?
So I started in 2016 as a substance abuse counselor, and then up until now. So it's about 7 or 8 years from substance abuse up to marriage and family therapy. And the marriage and family therapy has been about 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah.
Was it a difficult transition to go from working with people with substance abuse to then going into family therapy?
It is a significant difference, because you're taking someone as an individual and saying, this is the problem, how do we resolve it with yourself? And bringing in a family member changes the whole dynamics between everything. So you're taking a lot more of the systemic aspects within it, and it becomes a lot more difficult.
Yep. Fair enough.
And
Fair enough.
different too. So yeah.
Right. And it just requiring different approaches to try
Yes.
to get to the solutions. So, okay. So then what would you say would be like the hardest part about your job?
The hardest part about my job. So there are a lot of systems within therapy.
Right.
So there is, there's substance abuse. Well, actually there's domains. So there is addiction. So that, that includes substance abuse and, porn addiction or gambling addiction. Okay. So then you have so those are all subsystems of the system. So then you have, marriage issues. Then you have mental health issues dealing with depression and anxiety and bipolar, everything that goes within those domains. Then you have grief, then you have trauma, and you have all of these different domains. And the hardest part is that all of them involve hurt. All of them. You are meeting with people who are hurting typically. Probably in the 3 years that I've been doing marriage and family therapy, there's been 2 or 3 clients that I've met with that didn't experience some type of hurt. They're more just like, I just want to better myself. But all the other thousands that I've met with are experiencing some type of hurt. And it's very difficult to separate yourself from that hurt. Mm-hmm. And so you are on a daily basis kind of like, wow, I want to take this pain away from you, mm-hmm. but I'm not responsible for it and I can't really do anything. All I can do is provide a vessel to help you through this pain. Mm-hmm. And it's hard.
Yeah. No, well, honestly, I would even say one of the things that I'm practicing myself and understanding that when I do get into practice that I can't provide advice for people when I'm actually practicing because it's imposing my biased views to the situation, right? And even in my real life, I'm learning to not offer advice unless someone asks because sometimes my perspective, or really anybody's perspective that they believe that can possibly help them, may not necessarily help them. But we don't like watching them suffer.
Right.
Like it bothers us to watch them suffer. So we want to try to extend out the help, but that's not always necessarily helping them.
Right. And there's only so much we can do, and they have to do the work. It's just us kind of watching them struggle, but attempting to help them in the way that we do in the therapy realm.
I find that so funny because I think about that as that's something that everybody experiences, especially as you get older, and no one really talks about it.
Right.
All right. Like no one talks about that. It's the pain to watch somebody struggle, but you have to allow them to struggle so that they can move past whatever they're going through rather than trying to do it for them.
Yes.
And that's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah. The other idea that I had thought of is that the second hardest part that you're going to get involved with at some point is that you are in a very intimate relationship with these people. So they come into your office with their deepest, darkest traumas and regrets and, issues that they're having. And if you've seen this client for a year, it's hard to not establish some type of intimate relationship.
Right.
And when I say intimate, it's just a closeness of trust and everything. And then they stop coming. So it's kind of like you've lost this relationship, you've lost this part of you, this friend that you have talked to, kind of thing. As difficult as it is to separate yourself from a client when you've been seeing them for a long time, and they've trusted you and you've trusted them to divulge information, everything, it becomes a very difficult process.
Now, just out of curiosity, in these situations, is it more often that they stop going because of life circumstances, or is it more often that they stop going because they are able to kind of do it themselves?
They have been, typically it is, they've been giving the life tools that they need in order to be terminated, go through the termination process of, I no longer need your services. And that's the ultimate goal of therapy in the first place anyways, is, I've given you the tools and now you're utilizing them. And now I'm either not going to see you ever again, or maybe you just come in for maintenance.
Right.
But sometimes it is also life circumstances, and it's kind of like, okay, I've been seeing them for 6 months and then all of a sudden they stop coming, kind of thing. So it just depends on the situation.
Fair enough. What would you say is the most common reason why people come in?
I would say it would be depression and anxiety.
Okay.
And that could be within the scope of relational aspect, as in they're coming to therapy because one of them is experiencing depression or anxiety, and therefore they're both trying to help one another understand that depression or anxiety, or they're just trying to comfort the other person.
Okay.
But typically, on an individual level or through couples, it is some form of depression or anxiety.
So, if you can do me a favor, because I think a lot of people have their perspectives of what they think depression and anxiety is. Can you explain what would be diagnosed as depression or anxiety?
According to the DSM-5, or
According to the DSM-5.
So depression, it is an episode of time where you are experiencing, let's say you have a baseline of emotion or baseline of homeostasis where you are normal. And depression is this decrease in that baseline where you are experiencing, you're not eating as much as you usually do, a decrease in appetite or increase in appetite. It actually can be either a fluctuation, decrease in sleep, or, I should say increase in sleep as in you're in bed all day, lack of motivation, suicidal ideation. But those are pretty much the primary DSM-5 criteria for someone who's experiencing a depression.
Right, and it's got to be, I believe, at least 6 months.
Yes.
Right.
So
So
at least for major depressive disorder, for
Right.
that one specifically, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then and then with anxiety.
Anxiety, like general anxiety, it has actually very similar to depressive symptoms.
Right.
It's just that there is a mix in there as far as the the anxiety towards or nervousness towards like general would be anything at all,
Right.
kind of thing. Whereas social anxiety perhaps is you're nervous about social interactions and being out in public, and they show very similar symptoms. But general anxiety is more I have this anxiety for anything that is going around. Actually, a lot of times it's they don't really know what they're anxious about. They just know that they're anxious.
Yeah. So now, out of the people that you see, how many or what kind of percentage would you say do you feel like people self-diagnose before coming in?
Ooh, that probably 95% of people have already have written down on their intake forms, I have anxiety, I have depression, and then under that, have you been to therapy before? No, which is insinuating that they are self-diagnosing.
So are a lot of them correct?
I would say a significant amount of them are correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which kind of helps us understand a little bit of the stigma that apparently, people are coming in recognizing, hey, I'm experiencing this. I'm experiencing a lot of these symptoms. So it's quite helpful, actually.
Well, we're old enough to remember when WebMD came out, right?
Right.
So self-diagnosing has been going on for a really long time. I find it kind of comical because if majority of the people are really fitting in these categories, then I'm really curious on why so many people would be depressed and anxious now in comparison to before.
Right. So there might be a theory already out there. I'm not sure. But my theory in regards to that is called, I don't know, I call it simplicity theory.
Okay.
And so the further that we as a society get away from simplicity, so the further we get away from our main necessities, which is eating, sleeping, and procreating, the further we, increase our responsibilities. Mm-hmm. And so the further that we increase our responsibilities, the more anxiety and anxiety provoking and depression we face because we are not meeting expectations of those responsibilities. So the further we get away from simplicity, the more responsibilities we have. The more responsibilities we have, the more depression and anxiety we have.
That's so funny because one of the concepts that I had kind of correlates with what you're saying, which is I kind of broke it down in a general aspect of we lack accountability.
Sure.
And if we have more responsibility, and we don't want to be necessarily held accountable for it, so
right.
We stress out about it. And we create these environments in our own head.
Yeah. Yep. And social media just been, yeah, we don't have, that's a whole nother podcast, I suppose, on the effects of social media. But social media puts this perspective in our minds that we need the next new thing. We need everything in order to be happy, keep up with the times, whatever the case may be. And that creates another responsibility financially. And then we're always chasing.
And then the instant gratification on top of
Oh,
it.
of course.
It is like in everything that we have, if things are not done right away, if it's not set up right away, if things aren't perfect right away, we allow it to bother us.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because I always love to ask people, do other people get you mad, or do you allow people to get you mad?
Mm-hmm.
And some people would be like, no, other people can get me mad. And I was like, really? But most people would think about it and they'd be like, no, I guess I allow people to get me mad. And
right.
we control our emotions. Sometimes it's harder than,
of course,
than others in some situations. But
yeah.
So it's just trying to kind of get a hold of ourselves. I heard this saying and I thought it was so great. They said that your emotions shouldn't be driving the vehicle, but it shouldn't be in the trunk.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, that I like that because it's really true. Like, you should never dismiss the way you feel about something. You should think about why you feel that way.
Right. So in therapy, they call that the wise mind. And that is basically where logic and emotion. So maybe that's somewhere in the middle seat. So the trunk is that logic, or the driver's seat's the logic. And it just actually depends on the person. A lot of times, someone might be a logical person. Some people call that like personality traits. Mm-hmm. And then some people are more emotionally driven. But somewhere in between, at least what I hope to achieve in therapy, is to help people reach that wise mind where they're meeting, hey, I can control my emotions by my thought process. So meeting it with the logic.
Essentially a healthy balance.
Yes, healthy balance of both.
Heard. I like it. All right. Well, let's dive into, well, I guess we already kind of got into some of the therapy stuff. So my next question would be, what would be one of the most common reasons you find people not wanting to come to therapy?
If you're dealing with couples,
okay,
typically one person does not want to be there.
Okay.
And they're, our relationship is fine and just, we don't need a help kind of thing. So it's kind of that recognition of we don't need anything. And sometimes it's also, I don't want somebody involved in our relationship.
Right.
I don't want somebody, I don't want somebody hearing all of our deepest woes and everything and being involved. But in reality, that's exactly what they need. Mm-hmm. But I would say stigma is definitely, a big thing. Thankfully, I haven't run into it too much in the sense of, like, I've had a multitude of people who have been referred to me kind of thing, where it's like, a male teenager is typically not to be in therapy. But because of them going to school and saying, hey, I had this problem and I met with my therapist, he was really helpful, boom, on to the next referral and the next referral. Nice. So it's creating a ripple effect, which is huge. But I would say getting somebody actually in therapy, the most difficult part is, probably that age range of males who have been told that therapy is for people who have problems, and also the older generation too. Yes. The older generation is, kind of, people don't change. Mm-hmm. We are who we are. Don't try to change me. And a therapist is only there to say, how does that make you feel? And, and that's just not the case.
Yeah. And that's essentially, that's the whole goal of this, is just to create dialogue about this, around this. I want to talk to even people who don't believe in therapy, to just create dialogue around that disagreement, around that misconception,
right,
and these negative stigmas. So, and it's kind of funny because I would have presumed that the younger population would be more willing to go to therapy, because therapy is probably more I guess it would be a right way of saying, versus the older generation. But it does make sense about the younger or the teenage male population not being interested, because I do understand that people view therapy as being you could either looked at as weak, or they don't want to be vulnerable.
Right.
And honestly, I think most people don't really care to be vulnerable, especially if it's with somebody they don't know.
Right. Right. And I would say it has to depend on the father, or the mother,
okay.
because if the father's like, I'm all about therapy and I've been seeing a therapist for a long time, the chances are, they're going to get their son or daughter into therapy as soon as possible, just for developing coping mechanisms, not necessarily there being issues. But if there was never that involvement in this individual's life as far as the father or mother, then, it's just not going to happen, or it very seldom happens that they'll bring their kids into therapy. And, so it definitely depends on that generational pattern there. But I will say that the pattern, or I guess the transition, we are in that transitional period where stigma is ending and we are more growing towards the normalcy of therapy. And so it is definitely becoming more predominant. So
all right. So I'm going to present this to you then as devil's advocate. So there's a negative stigma with people believing that therapists will just diagnose somebody so that they can go get medication. They can just go get something. And therapists, unfortunately, there's a misunderstanding. Psychiatrists can prescribe medication. Licensed therapists, psychologists, they don't have the capability of prescribing medication, but they refer. But to that statement, if someone comes to you and be like, look, I don't want drugs, I don't want, things like that, what would you respond to? Because unfortunately, there are therapists that are doing that. There are therapists that unfortunately are not practicing in the way that it is said to be practiced based on the American Association of Psychology. So what would you respond to the people who see therapists that are practicing in a negative way like that?
I suppose this is actually something that I do every time that I see a client, is that I tell them, if I am not the therapist for you, go elsewhere. And when I say go elsewhere, I'm not saying please don't continue with therapy. I'm saying see a different therapist. We don't mesh. I cannot, treat you the way that you all therapists have their kind of their niche where if it's substance abuse or something along those lines, or grief or trauma, and if it's someone who's coming to me with trauma perhaps, and I'm not well versed in trauma, then I'll say, hey, I'm going to refer you out to somebody who I know personally. But to answer your question as far as the medication, typically I like to mention medication as a vessel. And when I say a vessel, I do not push it by any means. If they come in and they say, hey, I don't want medication, I'm like, all right, cool, let's start therapy then, kind of thing. But if they say, I'm so depressed that I can't get out of bed, then perhaps medication is the vessel to say, hey, let's start a medication that might help, and that if they were for medication perhaps, and then they went to a psychiatrist and they started a medication, then they can actually get out of bed, develop the coping mechanisms that they need, support systems and, self-care routines. Then they're actually able to decrease their dose and eventually get off that, because they now have developed the coping mechanisms that they need in order to get away from the medication. So that is typically the way I look at medication. However, what I will say is I have had clients who said my last therapist within the first session said that I need to see a psychiatrist and to get medication. And
wow.
To an extent, I'm like, I suppose I could see in certain situations, depending on what was divulged in that session, where that could be a recommendation. However, I would never push. It would be more of a, have you considered medication?
Right.
And have you been on medication before? Obviously getting their history. And then going from there to see, if they don't want medication, they don't want medication. That's the end of it. That's the end of the push.
Right.
Whereas some therapists may, like, oh, you really need to be on medication. You really need this kind of thing. Now, if it was someone with schizophrenia, that's probably one thing we learn in school is, hey, like they should often be on medication.
Right.
And often they come off their medication and then they go back into their schizophrenic state, and it's very hard to get them back on medication. So you refer them back to their psychiatrist, so there's all these steps and everything like that. But with someone with depression or anxiety, and the first thing that the therapist said is, well, you need to get on some medication, I would definitely question that.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. Now, I do want to ask you this because in my mind, especially going in, I have the mindset of wanting to do everything I can before not requiring, but even recommending medication. What would you say would be the reason why to not do that? Like, do you think everything could potentially be handled without medication? Except schizophrenia, because I do understand that that's a totally different animal.
So you're asking?
So specifically, I would go with depression and anxiety, considering that those are probably the two most common. Could those be addressed and handled for the most part without medication?
It depends on how detrimental of a state they're in currently. Okay. So kind of referring back to what I said before, is if they are in a depression so heavy that they cannot get out of bed, they are not taking showers, their thoughts of suicide, everything is so extreme that they can't actually start developing the process. Like if they cannot come into therapy, for instance, so like maybe they come into therapy one time and they're having a hard time coming in any other time because the depression is so great, it is hard for them to get out of bed. That is when I'd take a look at it and say, maybe medication is that vessel to at least get them back into therapy and then start the process of doing therapy. Yeah. Gotcha.
So it's really using medication as the tool that it's supposed to be. Because unfortunately, we do have a society, not even a society, a world right now that depends on medication.
Right.
So
medication, I don't want to say is the easy route, but sometimes it is the easy route. Mm-hmm. For some people, it is 100% necessary. Mm-hmm. And for others, I feel like it is. Medication's easier than me dealing with my emotions. It's easier than, dealing with anxiety or depression and actually starting to work out or starting, this process of self-care that actually releases endorphins and dopamine and whatnot. So it's easier to take medication that just releases dopamine for you.
Right. Well, and I'm sure my perspective will change once I start actively seeing people, because I will say this, though I've met what people have claimed to be very depressed people, I have never met somebody in a position like that. Mm-hmm. So that definitely could be an eye-opener for me, which is understandable. It's acknowledging just because you've never seen it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Right. And then theoretically with the therapy aspect is that a lot of times you're dealing with clients who have already somehow gotten past that depression, or and at least a little bit enough to be there with you kind of thing. So you aren't able to see them in their worst because now they're already in seeing you kind of thing. So you might not actually run into those people.
Well, that's fair. That's fair. So is it true that exercising is one of the greatest ways
100%.
Of
yes.
dealing with mental problems?
Yes, it is.
That's what I thought.
Specifically working out your legs, because your legs are your biggest muscle, and working out your biggest muscle releases the most amount of chemicals in your body to help with it.
Look at that. The more you know.
Right.
That's so funny. I didn't actually know that one. I understood that just having exercise routine within your day-to-day life, it impacts your life in a really positive way.
Right. A lot of therapy that I use goes based off the principle of one of Jim Carrey's statements, and don't hold me to this quote exactly. Maybe you know it, but he basically says, I believe in depression. I believe in anxiety. But if you are not working out, going out in the sun, involving yourselves in social activities, and eating healthy, something along those lines, then you're not giving yourself a fighting chance.
Yeah.
And so I usually take that quote and I'm like, okay, so in your life, let us kind of create this world of self-care that revolves around so many of these aspects. And then we will also address the mental health on top of that. But how can we address the mental health aspects if you can't do any of these other things? So that's where I like to start typically.
That's the truth. And that's a good place to start. So do you have like a specific intervention that you typically use when you are practicing? Like one that you like to go to?
Lots. But so for instance, that one, which is beneficial for you, is therapistaid.com. Okay.
Okay.
So that has a lot of worksheets and stuff like that on them. Okay. So what I do is I take a worksheet off, which is called the self-care assessment. And I usually give this to individuals within the first 2 or 3 sessions. And we will go through that self-care assessment. And this is like a physical self-care, mental health self-care, social self-care, work-life balance. So anyways, looking at all these dynamics within their life. And then what they do is they'll rate from 1 to 3. So it's a solution-focused approach using scaling questions. So from 1 to 3, how well are you doing in this? And how can we get you in a place that we're doing better within each dynamic of these domains?
Gotcha. Wow, that's pretty cool. One of my classes was emphasizing and talking about assessments prior to coming in and stuff like that, and the importance behind it because of the amount of information that you gain from those sheets. So it's really important for people to fill those out because it really does help the therapist understand where you're coming from before going into the conversation.
Right, which then helps us create goals. So yeah, if they're doing super well in that category, okay, let's keep doing that. But if you're doing poor in this category, okay, what can we do to build you up to this point, and how can I help you get you to this point as well?
Right. So a lot of therapists prescribe homework. Is that something that you say you also do as well?
Yes, I do. And it depends on the client. That is probably the biggest thing. So if I've given a client 3 homeworks and they've completed none of them, I'm kind of like, all right, I understand you're probably not going to do homework outside of that. So we will talk about the things that if you had done it kind of thing inside of therapy, because I'm not trying to set them up for failure.
Right.
I'm more just like, hey, you're obviously very busy. We'll just focus on the stuff that I would have you do out there in here, and we'll do as much as we can. So maybe it slows the process a little bit more.
Right.
But in the long run, still provide the same material, or try to give them the same material.
And just for people to understand, homework doesn't actually mean you're physically writing things. It's just different techniques that you can practice either by yourself or with somebody else, whether it's conversation, communication, or something of that nature.
Right. And I typically will create the homework based on what we've talked about, kind of thing. Beautiful. And sometimes it's difficult because there's not necessarily a plan in place. It depends on where the conversation goes. So it can be difficult to create the homework, but typically it's like a 5 or 10 minute reflection on like what we're talking about, how you can exercise this thing, and then writing about it or something along those lines.
Fair enough. And then to bring it in, review, and then go from there.
Right.
Fair enough. So this will be a 2-part. So first part is going to be, what benefit would couples have from going into therapy? And then the second part is going to be, what benefit would individuals have from going to therapy?
Okay. So let's, I guess we'll start with like imagining that we have this couple who is, let's say, just stable. They're fine. They run into some issues, but they're not coming to therapy for infidelity or something. So just so we have a baseline. They would benefit from going to therapy to strengthen their relationship. And in order to strengthen their relationship, something that I like to do is called relationship green flags. And that is basically taking a lot of domains within the relationship. So we have intimacy, we have honesty, we have communication, we have conflict resolution, all of these different domains within it. And then having them kind of talking about what it means to them, what that domain means to them, and then how they feel they personally are doing within that domain. And so if it is communication skills and they rate themselves at like a 4, so they're not very good at communication, I would ask them what would make them a better communicator. And then we'd probably take from that and try to increase the communication skills through interventions and whatnot. And then I also would like to talk to the partner and say, what do you give them? What do you think they're at a 4 as well? And sometimes they're being a little bit modest and they're like, oh, I think they're a great communicator. But I like to hear from both sides so that they're able to evaluate, how am I performing within this domain and how can I do better within this and what tools do I need to achieve that? And so I guess answering your question as far as the relational, there's always room for improvement. There's always room for improvement within each of these domains. And so the therapist is that way of saying, hey, how can we do better within each of these, and how do you see each other's perspective within them so that we can adjust accordingly.
And before you go into the individual, just on the couples real quick, do you find more success when you deal with the couples together, or do you like to have them maybe together first and then do individual later?
It's entirely up to the situation.
Okay.
So I would say I prefer them to stay together most of the time throughout all of the sessions.
Okay.
However, there are times where there's too much conflict and it's difficult for them to communicate, you know? So as the therapist, I'm able to like raise my hand and say, hey, we can't be doing this in here.
Right.
Yes, I understand that this is an argument, but this is not productive. It's not conducive to what we're trying to do here, kind of thing.
Right.
And if that happens throughout a lot of the sessions, like maybe it's 2 in a row or something, 2 or 3 in a row, I'll say, hey, it seems like we're having a lot of conflict here. We can separate and attempt to get a little bit more individualized goals towards the relationship so we can get on the same page.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So ultimate goal is to maintain together when dealing with together. All right. So then for individuals, what could an individual benefit from going to therapy? And let's go with someone who, like most people, don't think they have anything wrong with them, right? And you know, maybe they don't have any real traumatic experience, but for the most part, somebody has experienced something in their life. But what would you recommend, or what would you say people could benefit out of it?
I would say growth. It's always about growth. You know, individual growth, couples growth, and I would say it gives you a place to gain perspective. So because you think you have everything under control and you're fine, it's hard to I guess, understand what an outsider would say about you and their perspective. And so it gives you this intrinsic ability to say, to have someone else look at you and not necessarily say something's wrong with you, but more say, you know, what is going on in your life and is that where you want to be? And if it's not, then how do we get you there?
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. You know, it's something that I always think about because though I understand not everybody needs therapy, everybody really could benefit from talking to somebody with a different perspective.
Right.
Especially when you talk to somebody who doesn't necessarily have malicious intent, or somebody who doesn't really have an opinion whatsoever.
Just trying to help
right?
you.
Just
there's
they're
no
just
bias.
literally just there to kind of listen and just really listen.
Yeah.
Just, you know, how can I help you? And, you know, though I do see therapy itself growing, I want to push it more for people to be willing to just try it out. And hopefully we can get more people willing to practice addressing their emotional and mental wellness. Because we really don't. Like, we're willing to exercise our bodies. We're willing to exercise all these different things. But a lot of times we're not really willing to take care of our brain.
Right. And it takes a special self-awareness to do so. And I think that's the biggest thing to learn from therapy is like the self-awareness of where am I right now? Am I mentally okay? Why am I not mentally okay? And how do I get to that place where I am? Yeah.
And again, for me, I feel a lot of it comes down to accountability. I feel like people just don't take on, everybody has their own struggles. Everybody has their own things that they need to address. So knowing that you have yours, like other people have theirs, if you take care of yourself and if you want to help somebody else, the best way you can help somebody else is by taking care of yourself.
Right.
Because if you are at your best, then you can actually be there for somebody, to be your best for somebody else.
Right.
But unfortunately, a lot of people don't think that way.
Yeah. A lot of people think, you know, I can handle myself. You know, I'm fine. I can do this. I can do this. You know?
I can get by.
Right.
Okay. So the last thing really that I just want to kind of throw out is going to be, if you could provide some type of, I don't know, maybe advice or a suggestion that if people are struggling with whether or not they should go see a therapist, but they don't want to because they are afraid of what people are going to think, or they're afraid of what they might find out, is there any words of encouragement that you could provide to kind of ease the idea of going to just be willing to talk to somebody or go see you?
Something that I like to start off with in therapy is kind of just a humanistic approach, in the sense that I'm a human. I'm a regular person, so we think of therapist as this like entity of like, wow, I don't even know, you're absolutely right, just something superior, something that's just unique and crazy, but in reality I'm just a person, and I laugh, just like, I try to make most of my therapy sessions relatively humorous or whatever,
Right.
But because of television and whatnot, there's this stigma of an old man and you laying on a couch saying, woe is me and all these problems, but in reality it's like, no, let's have a conversation. Let's talk about what's going on and let's work on this. It's a lot more simple, at least conceptually, as far as what they're actually showing, I guess.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong, and it's so true. One of the misconceptions that I had for this podcast that I had looked up before had mentioned that a therapist has all the answers. And I thought it was absolutely priceless, because that could not be the farthest from the truth.
Right.
And I even had a conversation with someone just kind of explaining the fact that there's multiple interventions of how to approach something. And the reason why you're going to go to more than one session is because maybe the first approach might not be the best approach, or maybe there might be more to it than what is just first discussed.
Sure.
So there's a reason why it's called a practice, because they're practicing, right? It's understanding, like every other medical field, that it's, especially if you at least do your homework on who you go to see.
Right.
Most of the time, the goal is going to be to try to get you to whatever better position that you're looking for, that you want to be in. So,
right.
And yeah, I feel like people just don't give an opportunity to
right.
hear being a human.
Right. And another thing is that some people don't want to come to therapy because they are afraid of their past. They're afraid of talking about the traumas that they experienced, abuse, grief, just anything like that. And what I would recommend to those individuals is to seek a solution-focused therapist, someone who is taking you as you are right now, and how can we improve upon that? Because a lot of times we think we have to go into that can of worms in order to actually see any type of growth. But the reality is you don't necessarily have to talk about those traumas in order to benefit from therapy. In fact, I would rather you be in therapy and not talk about those traumas, but work on yourself, than not go to therapy at all.
That's so good. Love it. Well, Sean, listen, thank you so much for doing this. This is absolutely amazing. I will love to have you on again sometime. Please, the facility you're working at, it's called
Revitalize Counseling Center.
Revitalize Counseling Center. If anybody is in the Hernando County area in Florida, please reach out to Sean. He would love to be able to help and take care of you guys. It's absolute pleasure talking with you. I thank you so much for doing with this, and hopefully we can get more positive content out there.
Perfect.
To explore on.
Yes.
So.
And I appreciate your time. I appreciate what you're doing for the community, and I appreciate you becoming a therapist too, to help
man.
us out.
That's the goal.
Right.
All right. Thank you, man.